welcome to the Monopath podcast. Today I'm speaking with Gus Turner. Gus is the owner and actually the builder, I suppose, of Gafro Studios. He's a producer, record producer, mixer and mastering engineer who specialises in indie music and alternative rock. Speaking of rock, Gus is also a boulderer, which I appreciate sounds, at least to me, like a made-up word, but it isn't. A boulderer is a climber, a ropeless climber, so somebody who climbs unbounded without ropes or harnesses. And so we speak about some of that quite early on in the podcast, perhaps more than I had initially intended to, but I lay out why I thought that was a good idea. In any case, we spent most of the conversation centered on Gus's various applications for creative mindset, those beginning with building the studio itself and what that entailed, and the issues and problems that were solved while building it. And then more detail on the songwriting and production process itself. One thing to note for listeners to the podcast that you will not be able to appreciate is the sheer majesty of Gus's hair, which is where he gained the name for the studio. Gafro Studios is actually a shorthand, portmanteau of ginger and afro. It should give you some indication of what I was seeing while we had this conversation. Nevertheless, I managed to not be too distracted by that, and hopefully the conversation is a testament to that. But you be the judge. Anyway, the last thing to say is that if you are enjoying the podcast, then, well, thank you. And if you want to support, you can. And the best way to do that is just to share this with people who you think will gain something by listening to it, whoever that might be. Other than that, you can visit the website and click on the Support Me tab and help in other ways that are easier to measure. But I don't mind how you do it. I just appreciate that you've taken the time to listen. So, again, thank you. And without further ado, I bring you Gus Turner. Gus, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I am very grateful that you would do this. I have never seen a recording studio before that has a bouldering wall.
Oh yeah, it's a great source of distraction. We've also got a ping pong table.
You got a ping pong table too?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. But the bouldering wall, that I could be tempted to say that I've seen a ping pong table in a recording studio before, but I don't think ever. Bouldering wall is a new level.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well, with all the climbing walls being shut at the moment, I had a spare room that I've been wanting to do something with for a while. It was potentially going to be a lounge or something along those lines. And then the opportunity arose to build a climbing wall. So here we are.
It's fantastic. How tall is the wall?
It's about 2.5 meters tall and 3.5 meters wide, and it's on a 28-degree angle, so it's quite steep.
I've experienced bouldering once, and it's hard.
Yeah,
I underestimated it, and my arms were in a fairly high degree of pain the day after that. So it's quite strenuous. How long have you been into bouldering?
For the best part of 10 years now.
Oh my!
Yeah, I used to do it competitively when I was still a junior. Yeah, I competed all over the place.
Oh, nuts!
And then I got too old to be able to compete that badly. basically.
Maybe it's actually worth speaking about bouldering a little bit. It wasn't really my intention to go into it, but I do think it relates to some of the stuff that I had hoped to speak about. And maybe before you do that, it might just be worth you outlining a little bit about what you do with the studio and your professional work.
Yeah, so I run a studio called Gafro Studios in Elland. I built the studio myself over 2 years. We opened, it's just gone the 2-year anniversary since I opened the studio. I've worked with mostly local bands. I've done all sorts. It's been flat out since I opened the doors. It's been fantastic.
What's the desk that you've got in there?
It's a Amec Magnum. It's really old school, yeah, but not old school enough that it's worth an absolute fortune. But yeah, it's great. I bought it for very little money, but it was completely non-functioning, didn't pass audio through anything. So I spent about 6 months restoring that from scratch, which was horrendous. But when I was dismantling it, there's a big black stain in the bottom of the chassis, which the guy I bought it off told me was from when Robert Plant spilled a bottle of port all over the desk.
No way.
So that's quite so they left the big stain to, so they had a story.
That's quite the story as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fantastic.
I don't suppose many of the people who listen to this podcast would be deeply interested in equipment and things like that, although I am. So we may not need to get into too much detail about the specifics of analog and digital or different microphones and things like that. That being said, I do think there's something about equipment that would be interesting to speak about. Just before we get into that, let's do the conversation about bouldering. Let's speak a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Just because it may be interesting we can do this chronologically, I suppose. So bouldering is not a word in everybody's lexicon, I don't think. So again, it might be worth you just explaining to listeners what exactly bouldering entails.
So bouldering is rock climbing, but you don't use a rope. It's generally under 4.5 meters, especially indoors. And it's all about short, very powerful moves, a lot of strength. But other forms of climbing are more reliant on stamina.
Okay.
But bouldering is just strength and power and a lot of problem solving as well.
That's the bit that I'm mostly interested. I thought there was a benefit of beginning with bouldering because I haven't really given it too much thought, but I suspect there may be a useful analogy between bouldering and the creative process and how that is applied to your work in the studio. I don't know, but I suspect we may keep returning to bouldering.
There is a very bizarre correlation of people who I've worked with in music and then I find out that they're climbers. I know Al, who runs the Motor Museum, climbs. Bob Cooper climbs a lot. I know that most of the producers I've come across have dabbled in it at some point. So it obviously appeals to the same kind of person.
Yeah, for me, it was always... There was something interesting about the problem-solving aspect of it, but I also liked...
Yeah.
I think there's something there with efficiency, and because it's a little more about speed and solving that problem. It's a time-sensitive problem, and so solving that efficiently is me all over. I'm very careful about how I spend my time. I take it quite seriously, so I think knowing that I could go and do something that is exercise, but it's also enjoyable, but it's all about solving problems efficiently, I dig that. That's me all over.
You kind of don't really notice how physically demanding it is as well when you're focusing on that problem-solving side of it. Your focus shifts.
And the way that they build the walls, and I suppose you having built one now, you may or may not disagree with this because I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to climbing, but with the bouldering walls, the placement of your anchors, I don't know what they call them
Holds.
In bouldering terms, those holds, they're set at certain distances to create either the illusion of challenge or actual challenge, but they're put there with intention, and it's a way of shaping the problem to make there be different levels of that problem, if that makes sense.
And that's where it gets really interesting when you go and climb outdoors, because there's no intention behind them. It's purely someone has found this piece of rock and thought, I can climb up this, I think. And people spend years working projects that may not be possible.
I think that is... I'm so glad you went there anyway, because that was on one of the things I really wanted to get to, and the difference between those two things, the difference between having this relatively unpredictable, non-tailored surface, or problem, you can call it, versus a bouldering wall, which is synthetic and created with different degrees of that problem that's designed to be climbed. How do you feel about the difference between those two things practically when you're doing them?
It's strange because even though it's indoors or in a competition setting, it's done with intent. It's usually trying to mimic something you would find naturally. It's very rare that you actually can get away from that, the kind of natural formation of it. Have
you done a lot of climbing outdoors then as well?
Yeah, and especially through the past few weeks, so with the gyms being shut.
How would you look at climbing an unpredictable surface differently to looking at something that's structured?
Well, it depends on where, because a lot of the time I do a lot of climbing in a place called Fontainebleau in France, and it's possibly the most famous bouldering venue in the world. So it's kind of at a point where every single way of doing a climb has been done. There's not really any room for innovation, but there are plenty of places in the UK where it's just, but not many people have been there. So there's constantly new ways of working out how to do it.
Speaking of the French one then, would you learn and study the route that you would take before you go into it, or do you just dive in?
I'd usually try and do it a few times myself, and then if I wasn't getting very far, I might watch a video of someone else doing it.
Okay. So it's almost as there is a sort of obvious path, but it's harder to see.
They get established. It's not just a field of random boulders. People have come along and looked at them and worked out a way, and then they get the first ascent of it. And they're the ones who have solved it, basically.
Yeah, okay. So it's like a well-trodden path in that sense as well. The more people who climb the wall, the easier it is for other people to then climb it, because you'd imagine there's some kind of erosion on the wall from people consistently clawing at it.
Although it sometimes makes it worse.
Oh, really?
If it's a very marginal hold, or in Fontainebleau it's sandstone and it just wears away. Sometimes you'll come back the next year and there's a hold missing. It's just snapped off.
Which is good news when you're halfway up it.
Yeah.
When you're approaching a new wall or an unclimbed wall then, more locally, what's your mindset, or what is in your mind when you're making the first few steps up the wall? So what sorts of things are you focusing on or looking at?
Well, coming up to something you've never gotten on before, it's amazing how quickly you can go from not being able to get off the ground to getting up there. And once you've done that a few times, you realise a lot of stuff that doesn't seem physically possible is quite easily possible. And you've just got to... I've spent days on things, years, and not gotten off the ground, and then suddenly it just clicks and it goes and it feels easy.
Would you be looking at holds then when you're beginning the climb? Or
certainly before I would climb something successfully, I'd have done it in my brain hundreds of times round. I quite often will lie underneath the rock on the floor and just lie there, like moving my hands imagining every single move, every single nuance in the balance and the body position and everything. And quite often I can't actually get up it until I've done that a few times around. And then you get on it and it doesn't quite feel how you expected it to. So you've got to adapt to that. And then eventually they do go.
Yeah, that is really interesting, because that's almost as if you're simulating the experience before you've had it. And that's such a good proxy for the experience itself that you just can achieve it so much quicker. I find that's incredible.
And it's so satisfying when you completed it and you come down and you felt like you knew exactly what you were doing the whole way through. Once you've got it dialed into that perfection, that you're just repeating a set of sequences that you know exactly what you're doing. It's very satisfying.
There's the thing there as well of, I always think of it about learning to play the violin, and I'm not sure why I go there. The same would apply for learning anything or doing any skill, really. But you can't learn how to play the violin or learn how to climb a wall by reading a book about it. And usually that's kind of the one side of the knowledge question, really, is you could read everything there is about climbing that wall, but without experiencing climbing that wall, it's not enough. You haven't climbed it. And it's almost as if you're finding this mid-ground between those two positions.
Getting your body in the right condition and the muscle memory side of it as well, which definitely transfers to music. You could, if someone's tone deaf, it doesn't matter what you tell them. If they've not got a good ear, they're not going to have a clue what you're talking about.
Do you have, maybe you have your own opinion on this, and that's different to whether it's objectively true or not, but do you have some kind of inbuilt talent for climbing?
I'm quite tall and I've got long arms, but that's about it. When I started it, when I was 13, I was very much the opposite of the kind of desirable climber physique, which is usually kind of fairly short, but very, very light. And I was 6 foot and quite chubby and couldn't do a single pull-up. But it's with what's now pushing 10 years of perseverance, I'm still competing at a fairly high level. Sometimes
those anomalies are what work, though. It reminds me of Arnold Schwarzenegger breaking into Hollywood and into movies, because he just ended up using his relatively unusual physique as a strength in the end, and he outcompeted everybody else in that way, because there was nobody else who was a bodybuilder who acted in the way that he did with the delivery that he did. And it's almost as if there's a analogy there between the stereotype of a shorter, lighter climber and what you did there as well, especially if you managed to have some success with it.
You definitely get used to having to try harder than everybody else. And then when you overcome that, whatever the obstacle was, suddenly you're just used to working at that level. And that's when you really excel.
It feels more rewarding to me when that's the case as well, when you've had to work a little harder than everybody else to get something because of one reason or another. The reward just seems all the more joyous when you finally get there. Let's take that to music then. That was a nice little segue from bouldering. I hadn't anticipated to get into so much bouldering, but I do find it interesting when I don't know really much of anything about something. So thank you for indulging me with that very briefly. Studio stuff though, I thought my history with studios, like I've done something similar. Like I took part in building my own studio, so building my own computer and everything, sourcing my own equipment, kind of building all the baffles for the walls and everything like that. And I have always said that I am definitely not more talented in any of the instruments that I play, or I'm no more skilled at recording. Frankly, there's so many more people who spring to mind for me who are better at guitar or piano or recording or singing or whatever it might be, that I don't really rate myself in that way, but I've always thought that I was more determined to do it regardless of those things than most people. You seem maybe like a kindred spirit in that sense. I don't know if that would be fair to say. Where did that come from? Have you always had that?
Yeah, well, I've been making music since I was about 5. So I've always, it's always just been about kind of making do with whatever I've had. And when I built the studio, it was just, it was very good timing for me when I decided to build it, that I could basically pour every penny I had into it to make it as good as it could be. And it was never going to be Abbey Road. But I still, to this day, believe it's the best it could possibly have been under the circumstances.
That's all you can do. To bring it around to creativity, this is a podcast where I like to talk about not just the creative process, but what creativity is. I think there must have been some fairly creative decisions to go into building a studio, a high profile studio and a well-equipped studio, but on a strict budget. Maybe you could go into what some of those decisions were or how you came to them.
Well, it quickly became apparent that I couldn't afford the gear that I wanted. So I started buying it broken and fixing it. Pretty much all of the high-end gear in that studio was non-functioning when I got it. And that was obviously that was the obstacle I had. And the only way to overcome it was to learn how to fix these things.
Yeah, I think sometimes people on the outside may falsely believe that you were just handed this money and everything was nice and simple and easy. Do you get that a lot?
So last year I was working with a band called Full Colour, who are now on their way to stardom. We did an EP together and they got picked up by a label called Good Soldier. And the guy from Good Soldier was down in the studio. We did a showcase for them, and he did not believe me that I'd built it myself and hadn't inherited loads of money. And he was like, "Show me pictures of you building it. I don't believe you." And then when I finally convinced him, he said, "Well, I might have to give you a job one day."
Well, it's beyond belief. Sometimes, though, when, I've had a few of these conversations on the podcast now, and one of the themes that's underlying this was about people who've gone on to either learn an instrument or learn a skill in drawing or whatever it might be, really, is that there's an outside judge and they can't, because they haven't seen the formative experience growing from nothing to something, they almost come to some conclusion that you must have climbed to the top of a mountain without ever moving up it. You just wished yourself there at some point. Which is an odd thing, and I wonder if that's the thing that holds people back sometimes, is that they have an expectation that these things are easier or easier than they actually are.
Yeah, I think possibly a more cynical view on it as well is that people who don't want to put the legwork in and don't understand why they aren't at the top already, they just they often give up before they've really had a chance. But pretty much everyone who's successful has had to go through that.
Yeah, well, I do look at things in terms of their problems. That's just how my mind works. So I don't really use the word problem as something that fills me with anxiety. It's not a pejorative. It's quite a positive thing. And if I've seen what the problem is, then it implies that that there is a solution to it. It's not completely mystifying. There's no mystery there. If I'm Gus and I'm hoping to build a studio and I don't have the money to do it, but I can get the equipment I want for cheaper and just repair it, then there's a problem there which is solved by learning how to repair that equipment. It's just a bit of a sideways route, which, to bring it back to the bouldering analogy, which I'm glad we went through the trouble of making clear first, it is almost like having to reach sideways and move sideways before going upwards. Sometimes you have to do that.
Or people who aren't tall enough to reach something. You'll see quite commonly in bouldering competitions, people who aren't tall enough to reach things will find the most ridiculous creative ways of getting up there. If they can't physically do it the way it's intended, they just make one. Such
as what? Maybe leaping or?
Yeah, often. Or you see people contorting themselves into all sorts of ridiculous positions to just get themselves up there. Especially with the younger climbers, obviously.
Yeah, I think with youth as well, there is more of a desire to be, or an inclination to be, open to these new ways of doing things, because you almost want to be at the frontier of novelty. It's a search for infamy, I suppose, in a way.
And they don't generally care about doing it the way it's meant to be done.
Yeah, that's one of the things I like about me. And I'm quite self-critical, but I do like that about me, is that I don't really get too hung up on what everybody else is doing, or the common ways of doing things. I like to just see that there is a common way of doing things. And if I don't think it's useful to follow that route, then I'm quite ready to get off of it. I'm usually fairly eager to look for the alternatives first. I don't just take it for granted that the way that everybody else is doing something is the way to do it.
I definitely follow the same kind of path with that. I mean, I had 5 offers for university when I left school and turned them all down. I had unconditional and turned them all down on results day, and told my parents I was going to go work in a supermarket and build a studio.
Nice.
This was also when my brother was at Oxford. So you can imagine that went down well.
Yeah, I can. I had a similar thing with my parents when I was younger. I remember telling them when I was maybe about 17, maybe a little older, that I was going to pursue music because I was enjoying it so much as a hobby and I wanted to take it more seriously. To be honest, even later in my life when I've been doing the same thing with philosophy, and it's always been met with complete confusion and a bit of despair, but that doesn't make, there's no easy way to do that, and we're worried now, so don't do that.
Yeah.
But I've always just been quite happy I trust myself. I trust that if I think it's a good thing to do, then I'm not so incompetent and deluded that my doing it will just end up with me in a ditch.
Yeah. Well, I definitely felt like I was taking a risk, but it didn't seem like an unnecessary risk.
Well, and that is the word, isn't it? Risk. I am not so risk averse. I'm not a gambler either, but I think there is such a thing as that some bets are safer than others. And so something like music for me was always an easy win because, well, I got to do something I enjoyed as well as learning more things about what I was already enjoying, like developing those skills associated with working in the music industry, whatever avenue I happened to be exploring at the time. And so it was a no-brainer. If I could get paid to do those things, then the obvious thing to do was to fulfill them.
Yeah. It doesn't really seem, in hindsight, it doesn't really seem like a risk if you're enjoying yourself.
Yeah, totally. Let's bring this back to the creative process then and get into the studio a little bit at this point.
Yes.
So you managed to source your own equipment and building them and things. Let's talk a little bit more about what actually happens while you're in the studio. I'd like to keep it on equipment though, if that's cool. And as I say, I don't think we really need to go into too much detail about the equipment specifically unless you really want to. But I was interested to know what you think equipment adds to the creative process when it comes to producing music.
For me, it's it's more just the speed of it. The way I have my studio set up is that I can record in any part of the building with any instrument, and it's just there. It's just ready to go. I turn the desk on and I push the fader up, and sound comes out. And there's no messing around generally. That's why I don't have massive amounts of outboard gear. I mix almost entirely in the box because I'd like to just get on with it.
Yeah, just for people listening to this as well, in the box referring to not having outboard and relying on software and things intrinsic to the computer instead.
And there are certain aspects where I feel like it's worth the nuisance. Like I have plenty of outboard preamps, but short of that, I don't really bother. I like to just get the bands in and focus on the actual kind of creation of the sound, like spending a long time tuning drums, choosing instruments and things like that, rather than spending ages, EQing something on the way in.
Yeah, what's the selection process like for, say, picking which drum kit to use or which snare to use or which guitar to use? How do you make the choice?
Well, it often boils down to how long the band are in the studio for. I definitely have a go-to set of tools that I know work, and they get you 90% of what's probably the best result. But if you've got the time, well, I worked with a band called Dead Wax a few months ago, and we spent the best part of a day before we'd even recorded anything getting the drums up. We ended up changing the skin on a snare drum 3 times for 3 different skins until we found one that we liked. We ended up using 2 crash cymbals as hi-hats.
Wow.
2 16-inch crashes as hi-hats, which sounded amazing, and really brought the drum part to life. But the only real process is just try it. You're never going to quite know what it sounds like until you've tried it. And I've done some really bizarre things in the studio.
Yeah, I do want to talk about some of those bizarre things as well. But just before we do that, this is where it gets into the philosophy of it a little bit as well. But what sort of thing is in your head when you're picking an instrument? Say, for example, you are dabbling and you're changing these skins on the snare or choosing different cymbals. How is it that you know that, okay, we've done enough now, we've got the right thing?
I think you have to be able to visualize the end product, which again kind of goes back to the bouldering analogy of you've got to have it pretty clear in your head what you want it to sound like. And that's kind of the skill of working with bands, isn't it, really, that you've got to, often in a limited time frame, you've got to work out what they want and make it real. And bands like to use very vague terminology, or just make it sound huge.
Remember.
So it's turning that and making it into something that actually makes sense and how you get there.
So there's 2 things. There's the skill on one side, and there's the feeling, the intuitive feeling on the other side. And I think when you have little experience, or certainly less recording studio experience, you're more likely to speak in terms of how it feels, which is why words like just make it sound huge probably follow from that. But then the other side of that thing is when you have gone to the time of developing the skill, what you've done is you've made it more verbal, I suppose, in your head. You can put it into words what you want. It's almost if there's a mental space, and for the less versed recording individual, that is a fuzzier, a more vacuous space. It's not as easy to kind of say, I can see exactly what I'm looking at and what I want. Whereas for somebody perhaps like you, who's worked in a recording studio and built it themselves, you might have a more defined picture of that end product before you even begin.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I don't work out of any of the studios. I don't feel like I really need to, because I know that place inside out. So when someone comes with an idea, or they aren't happy with something and they want to change it, most of the time I can get there because I feel like I just know everything there inside out. And that makes it easier to try new things as well.
Yeah, when it comes down to talking about what the end product looks like, how large is the difference between how the musician who's kind of commissioned you to produce the work and your way of speaking about it?
Yeah, it's quite common that they don't really have a clue. And I have had someone ask it to be more purple, which was a nice one. But you can kind of get behind that, can't you?
Yeah, I've always felt music as colours. I think that's fairly... Oh, it's not completely uncommon in music. I've come across a few people who pay attention to the shape or the colour of the music. I've felt that all my life, and I always believed that everybody else did. So when I used to produce records, I always thought about them in terms of the colour, and how I knew something was right was if the colour fit. So to give an example, something like a Telecaster, for me, a Fender Telecaster guitar, was pretty much always an orangey yellow kind of thing, but very sharp. For whatever reason, yellow and orange is what sharp and scratchy kind of is to me. And that was always the guideline for whether this is right, whether it's the right instrument or whether it's the right guitar sound or drum sound or whatever it is. It always came down to, does the colour that I'm hearing now complement what I thought I heard when I first heard the demo or the live version of the song or whatever it might be? That was always the guideline, which made it very difficult to talk about because I would speak in those terms, and people who came into the studio who didn't know me too well or who hadn't recorded, for example, before. I had a lot of young musicians come into the studio. They would just presume that was producer speak. And so they just spoke to me in those terms and kind of allowed me to lead them there, thinking that's what everybody else did. And that just perpetuated my own false belief that everybody else thought in the same way that I did. But it turns out it's a little more unique to me than I believed it had. I mean, is there anything like that for you?
I've not had anything quite like that. And I also find that I have days where I just cannot make very good music, and it just sounds completely different. But I don't use any reference of colour or shape or anything now.
Is it just because I think there's, again, going to that dichotomy I laid out, which may or may not be right. I don't think it is right, but it's loosely right, between skill and intuition. Intuition is more when it's felt. So when something is right, do you just get the feeling that it is, okay, this is the right thing, maybe it's the right chord, or maybe it's the right drum skin? Or do you know it is? Are you able to verbalize why it is? Because let's say, that's hitting that frequency that I was really looking for there, and so on and so forth. I mean, which one do you trust the more?
I don't get too technical about it. It's very much just, well, that sounds good and it sounded bad before. I'm usually quite quick to throw away bad ideas or okay ideas or even sometimes slightly good ideas. Especially with recording takes as well. If something wasn't perfect, I'll just bin it. Or if we're trying an idea and it doesn't work, I'll just bin it.
You're not too precious with that. Quite open to making mistakes then, I would have thought.
Yeah, it's very much the binary yes or no. Not, oh, that was okay, but we might be able to fix that. It's just, no, that wasn't good. We're going to do something different.
Do you constantly return to that then when you're writing music or producing it? Do you constantly return to the yes or no?
Yeah, I think even subconsciously, you instantly know whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea. And I think a lot of the time people have an okay idea and they think, oh, I might be able to turn that into something. But I don't know. It's rare that I dwell on like an okay idea.
Yeah, for me, I know when I'm maybe more when I'm writing music and it's just me at home on GarageBand or on the piano or something like that. I'm much less precious about it but I will spend time on bad ideas. Like I will let myself get it out of my system. So sometimes I think this might be a bad idea. It might be a good idea. I'm not sure enough yet. So I'm going to act as if it's a good idea until it gets to a point when it's quite obvious that it isn't. And so I'll get stuck on pieces of music that I'm trying to develop. Sometimes for years that'll just sit there in the maybe pile. There is one that I'm working on now. I've been thinking about it this morning. It's just, I keep coming back to it and I can't get over it. And I still believe it's a good idea. And yet it never works.
Yeah, I find it hard to be satisfied by something that at any point seemed like a bad idea.
Are your standards quite high?
Especially in music, yes. Yeah. I haven't released any music of my own. Really, I mean, I had a band when I was younger that I released some music with, but I have sat on a lot of what I think are good ideas and they're still not where I want them. But they're good enough to not bin.
Okay, I'm with you on that. I want to speak to you about your own music. I know I keep breaking up the conversation like this by saying I want to talk about one thing and then going on to another. But here we go. I think there's more to be said about the studio process is all. You mentioned earlier about, maybe non-specifically, but about time constraints and the difference between the sessions when there's a budget and they only have a few days versus kind of this unlimited space and this complete freedom to pursue whatever it is. Do you have a preference between one or the other? Do you think there's any value to shortened time?
I always prefer the longer sessions because even the longest sessions I've done are tiny in comparison to the amount of time that's spent on these big commercial albums. What I consider a long session I did back in January. We did 3 tracks in 14 days. Which is loads of time. But if you compare that to some of the stuff the major labels are doing, they spend years on things.
Totally. I wondered if there was a bouldering analogy there as well between the unprovided wall that is natural, that you might go climb in France or in Yorkshire, and the one that's in a bouldering facility. The difference between those being the complete freedom of having no budget and no limitation, whatever, like the natural wall, you could go anywhere with it, and the bouldering wall, which is a little bit more like having a little stricter budget, and you've got different degrees of they color code, don't they?
Rules. Yeah.
I always thought I tried to take time quite seriously when I was recording, and so I would have really long days was my preferred way of doing it. I didn't like to start early, but I liked to have long days. So I avoided doing short sessions until maybe later on in the project. If somebody's coming in to record vocal overdubs or something, that I'm all right with that being shorter. But generally at the beginning of a project, those days will be long and consecutive as well, because I feel like there's an amount of time that you need to get into the rhythm of making the record. And if, say, I was going to go to the studio now and try and record in 2 days 3 songs, I feel like the first day is just spent getting into the rhythm of I'm in a recording studio.
You feel like you're just kind of doing it to be effective and efficient and not actually trying to create anything amazing. You're just trying to, you know that there are these parts and you just want to record them and get it done.
Yeah. The priority is different there, isn't there? There's a shift in priority between time or money being the most important influence on the work that you're creating and the final product itself, which really the obvious thing is to say that that's the priority. That being said, there is some virtue to time constraints and all kinds of constraints that's just there for the sake of making things a bit easier to do in terms of bouldering. Like the fact that there's a bouldering wall with different color-coded holes is to make it easier for some people than others to climb it. And so but the time constraints, I think, can have the same effect. I don't go into the studio, for me now, when I do go into the studio, I'm not the producer, I'm the artist. But when I go in, I do have some set of constraints on time. Okay, this is how many days I'm willing to spend on this amount of songs. It's not completely open-ended, because I think that means I'm more likely to go off the ropes and pursue things that probably should be pursued at home.
And you end up spending a lot of money.
I think that's the difference as well. Like, one way I think about it is that because now you can get so much of the technology at home, I mean, I still think there's so much more reason to go to a studio than just the technology itself, which we can get into. But learning that technology yourself, so learning and getting fairly adept at things like, GarageBand or whatever it might be at home, and just learning how to record at home, that's part of the process that you can do at home. And so, like, demoing your own songs before you go into the studio is just part of knowing what your songs actually are before you go into the studio.
Yeah.
Do you find that many people include that process, or think it's valuable at all?
I love it when people do. It definitely makes my life easier and spend less time, waiting for people to learn parts and things. But I'd say about half the musicians I work with do.
Yeah.
And when they do, they usually go to town with it, and they've got immaculate demos with all the harmonies and all these synths going on. And it's fantastic when people do that. Yeah,
it's just if time is sensitive for some people, or money, maybe more specifically for others, then it seems like there are some things you can have the best of both worlds by just exploiting the availability of technology in your home and doing these sort of basic steps, because it makes it easier for you to explain to the producer what it is exactly you want, and you don't have to do it verbally. You can just give them something sonically and say, this but better.
I'm actually in the middle of a project at the moment. We did 3 tracks and got to the mixing stage, mixed all 3. They were really happy with 2 of them. And the 3rd one just wasn't quite what they'd envisioned in their heads. So I gave them just some kind of half-mixed stems. And they've taken the song, and through all this lockdown, they've added all sorts. So that they've kind of done it the other way around. They've taken it where it's almost complete, and then they've completely overhauled the song. And they've sent me back their changes, and now I'm just dropping them back into the original session.
That's such a good idea. I would never... That's not an intuitive thing to think of either, because you just... The process that you go through when you make a record is usually have the song, go into the studio, record it, leave. I think that's what people think.
They kind of think, oh, it's too late to change that now. So we did it, and they really weren't happy with the synth sound that we'd gotten, because we had rushed it. It was the last day of recording. So they've spent like 3 weeks getting this synth sound right, which would have cost them thousands to do in the studio.
Yeah.
So between the 4 of them, over the past few weeks, they've got it perfect. And it's such a simple thing to just drop it back in, but I think a lot of artists assume it's too late to go back to that now.
Yeah, I think with you as well, there's the difference there between you as a problem solver. And so I think if you had been put in that position, and maybe the reason you are in the position you are in now is because if something wasn't working, you're quite happy to just go, this isn't working, let's do something different, let's do something else. I can't get there the traditional way. I'm going to have to do something sideways. I have to make a lateral move because forwards is failing me so far. It reminds me of, in principle at least, it's very similar to having the musicians mix it themselves with the faders, just the levels, and get them to feel it themselves. And even though largely that's just a reification of what you've already done, and it's not that much different, having them do it seems to, letting them experience and go through it, seems to make the whole mix seem more concrete for them.
I think some musicians as well feel that it seems so overly complicated to mix a song when when they see all these plugins you've brought up and all this processing you're doing, that they think, God, I don't want to get anywhere near that. I can't really have any influence on this. But something either doesn't sound right or does sound right. They don't really know how to articulate what's wrong with it because of the technology side of it.
Yeah, and it seems such an easy thing to do these days as well. It's just a skill. It's the problem is, okay, well, if the problem is the same as yours, it's a financial constraint on the artwork, then you've got to be creative about how to solve that problem. And so there is a few sideways moves there that you can make by taking something like GarageBand that costs next to nothing and making demos and learning how to talk producer, because a producer has really only done the same thing but backwards. A producer is, to me, somebody who has spent the time learning how to speak drummer and speak guitarist and speak in all of these different languages. So it seems almost a bit too costly to not have that expectation the other way around. There's more to say about your production, though. So in terms of how you approach a production, maybe it's a case of what percentage is it that is left for songwriting and what's left for kind of rehearsal time still? I suppose a better way of asking that is, how much of the production is songwriting?
Usually not much. It obviously depends on the artist. Some bands come in and they've got it nailed. They've got the whole arrangement bang on, and sometimes band play a song and you think, it's only 2 minutes long. Where's the rest of the song? And it's how open bands are to letting you have that influence. Some bands will happily let me rewrite sections of the song. Some bands just want some help with harmonies and, some little arrangement things. I think it varies massively between musicians of how precious they are of the work they've already done.
Do you have a preference between one or the other?
I like to work with the bands, but not too overpowering. Yeah, it's very easy to come up with an idea and think, that's so good, they need to have this in their song, and then the band don't like it.
Yeah, I think I always approached production as somebody was coming to me because they knew what my taste was like and what my particular set of skills was in music. I mean, I never thought I was great. I mean, I said this earlier as well, I suppose, but I don't think I'm great at many of the instruments that I play. I'm not the best performer, but I always thought I was a good songwriter. That's the place that I put faith on. So when I was producing bands, that was my primary focus on the song. So I always practically insisted on pre-production sessions where I would just go and listen to the rehearsals and give them bits of feedback on the structure or the arrangement, or less so on specific parts, but just general sort of thing. And so now, because of that experience for me, when I go into the studio, my expectation is that a producer I work with says the same sorts of things to me. I don't want to go into the studio and have it be a surprise. Here's the songs.
Yeah, just record what you've already got.
Yeah.
Again, it's different for all artists, isn't it? But the most successful sessions I've had have definitely been along those lines of a lot of collaboration between myself and the band.
I think it brings the best out of everybody as well, because the worst sessions that I ever ran, and maybe they weren't objectively the worst, maybe they were fine sessions and the band enjoyed them, but for me as a person experiencing those sessions, the ones where I was almost robotic in the sense that I was just there to press record, I found dismal.
Yeah. I think that the most rewarding sessions are definitely the ones where you find something completely new that you really weren't expecting. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but when you have that kind of aha moment of, wow, this has transformed the song. This wasn't on the cards when we came into the studio. No one had thought of this, and now it's really transformed it. Those are always the best sessions for me.
I just feel like as if you get a sense of kind of purpose from it, a sense of meaning. Like this feels good. Like I'm enjoying it because me as the producer, I'm putting something into this as well. I'm not just a mirror reflecting things back at them.
Yeah, I think everyone involved in the process wants to feel that the producer has taken it to the next level, because that's the point, really.
Yeah. There's a trust thing there, I would imagine, and the degree of trust that a group of strangers can have for one person they've never met before. Yeah. But I think that's the thing that people should focus more on and select producers based on their trust in them to produce something valuable. Speaking of songwriting, you mentioned about your own music and writing stuff. I know you sing, but is that your primary interest? Is it singing, or is there other instruments there that you've kind of grown up with?
I played piano briefly when I was very young and quickly moved on to guitar. I played guitar since I was 7. And then it was when I was basically trying to start bands when I was like 14, 15 and couldn't find any singers that I thought I could probably give that a go. Sang very badly for a few years, and then again with the problem solving thing, just learned to sing. I had many singing teachers over the course of about 5 or 6 years, and it really felt like I was learning to sing from scratch. I was pretty bad at it. It would be nice to think I'm not that bad anymore. But again, a weird skill, singing, in that a lot of people don't think it can be taught or learned. I'm not sure if you've come across that.
Yeah, plenty of the time. I think it's so personal though, because it's the voice. It's not like a guitar. I still feel it sometimes now. I can almost hide behind a piano or another instrument because it's not as close to being me as my own voice is.
You can almost blame the instrument if it doesn't sound good.
Yeah. I mean, I deeply sympathize with your story there, because when I was about 7 years old or something like that, I used to get bullied for my voice, which is hilariously ironic now, given that's kind of where I make some of my living from, using my voice. And I couldn't sing until I wasn't even interested in music until I was in my not quite late teens, mid-teens, about 15 years old I was when I first picked up an instrument. I picked up bass guitar and started singing. I'd never done anything like that before though, so I was very much a late bloomer, but I just, as you say, sounded horrific and just saw that it was a problem and knew what I wanted at the end, which was to be able to do some things. I went, well, I'll just keep doing it. I'll get better if I keep doing it. And eventually that's where I got. What's your music like then? The sort of music you write? What's your taste like?
I mean, I listen to like 80s classic rock.
Nice.
Mostly. And it's amazing how much the bands I've worked with in the past few years have kind of transformed my taste in music and the music I write as well. I'd never have dreamed of kind of getting into indie or indie rock stuff. And the past 6 months, I've been kind of shifting that way, which is really interesting for me. That it's something I've never even considered.
The philosophy of that is that you are less of your own thing as you might think, the same as everybody else, really. It's a bit of a shared experience between you and everybody else, and so you can't really control what ideas pop into your head or what music you like as much as you can just... You're necessarily influenced by the people or the environment that you're in, I suppose. And if you happen to be around one type of music, say, more than others, you're going to end up liking that more than you probably would have done before.
Well, yeah, I basically had some accidental success with this indie band last year, and all the projects that came off the back of that were very similar, like indie pop stuff. And that then turned into the kind of reaffirming that maybe I am actually quite good at producing this kind of music, of what originally wasn't something I set out to do. I then realised maybe I'm quite good at this. And then that turned into, it turns out I can write this as well and perform it. And here we are.
Yes, a surprise to yourself sometimes. But
Yeah.
I love those little surprise moments because the fact that you couldn't see them yourself is makes them quite pleasant, I think, because it's completely novel, like that whole pursuit.
You find as well that the ideas you come up with are so much more original because having not really listened to any of that kind of music, you have a completely different perception of what that genre is. To write in a genre that you've never really listened to, you end up... So I mostly listening to classic rock and metal and all sorts, and then writing an indie pop song, borrowing those elements from those heavier genres is just... you feel like you're creating something fresh.
Yeah, totally. I think you're transforming what's already in your head into some different medium and just making it your own thing. Certainly sounds like that. For me, I've again, probably from a similar sort of background as you, I think I used to listen to like heavy music, like not really like classical rock or anything like that, but certainly the metal. I was really into the metal. Not as much anymore, but more into the prog metal things as I've got a bit older. But I always loved heavy music when I was growing up. I was a bit more angsty, like most kids, but really into that. And the bands that the bands that I have been in were always rock. So it was always guitar-based music. And as I got older, it got more and more prog-like and a bit more experimental. And then at some point, when I started writing on my own, which is about 5 years ago, that all changed and everything just got less complicated, really simple, to the point, pop songs. But they were still alternative. They were pop songs that are a bit sideways and a bit unusual because of the way that I am coming at pop music, I suppose. I'm bringing all of the tricks and the skills that I've learned from listening to rock music, as you say, and putting them into pop music. And I never thought that I would write the sort of songs that I write now, which are kind of upbeat, sometimes more melancholic, but very far removed away from things I wrote 10 years ago. But as you say, I found that that's the more rewarding thing to do because there's a difference between mimicking bands that you like and doing your own thing. Have you found that with your original work?
Yeah, definitely. I think when you're trying to write in kind of the style of the bands you listen to, you're all the time thinking, oh, that sounds like that song, and that sounds like I borrowed it from them. I think it's hard to come up with original ideas when you're writing in very similar genres to what you listen to.
Yeah, one of the songs, a different song that I've been writing for years, actually, at this point, and it's one of the ones that I can't give up. And it just sounds all right, and I like it, and I believe it's a good idea. But then I was listening to some of the music that I would usually listen to, like, again, rock music, and I just thought it sounded too similar. And I don't think I'll ever get away from the fact that it does actually just sound a bit similar to music that I would naturally listen to. And as much as I try and shoehorn it into a different genre, in fact, no, I mean to say that differently. Shoehorning it into a different genre is the only thing that will make that work. Because at the moment, it's almost following the same genre that it came out of, and it means that it just ends up feeling no different to the original. Well, one of the things that surely must have inspired it. I don't ever go into anything trying to pinch somebody else's work, but sometimes you have no control over it, do you? You just kind of, you have this idea that you think it's your own because you've no idea where it came from, and then it turns out that it's actually quite similar to something else.
Yeah.
So I think putting it into the new genre is the only way to get away from that. With you as a producer, is that something you ever think about when you are actively infiltrating somebody else's work?
Not so much from a production standpoint, but I did a project with a friend of mine who is really big in trance music. So complete polar opposites in the kind of musical spectrum. And we somehow acquired an investor, and we did this big 6-month project where we were making music for TV Sync. And we set out to create 30 songs in 6 months of basically of any genre. And we basically set out and we wrote a list of artists, and we'd go in and say, right, today we're writing a song that sounds like U2. And we've got this list of songs. We did all sorts of artists that we just kind of, most of the artists we don't listen to as well. It was what our perception was of this artist and their music, and then incorporating that into our music. We came up with some of the best songs we've ever written.
Nice. Are they available to hear anywhere? Are they out there in the world?
They aren't. Not currently. No, hopefully they'll be, on some trailer for a Netflix original or something, yeah.
That's a really interesting approach to songwriting as well, to do it like that. I remember struggling with songwriting years ago, back when I was in a band, and we'd been in the band for quite a while at this point, and we'd lost, the guitarist had left. So it was just, we were down to a 3-piece, and we thought, let's shake this up. And we started spending rehearsal sessions by saying, okay, let's do 15-minute bursts of song ideas. We'll do 15 minutes where we'll just work on anything. We'll just 15 minutes on one thing, and then straight after we'll move on to something else. And we just kept jumping from one idea to another, so that after the end of like a 2-hour rehearsal, we had 8 beginnings of ideas. And it just meant, as a springboard for creativity, we didn't feel... You mentioned the yes-no kind of stage of rejection or approval. And it was almost as if we didn't have to bother with that, because it was automated. It was just automatic. It was every 15 minutes. We knew that we were just going to stop, and then it didn't matter if we weren't going to use it. We knew at the end of the session there was 8 ideas that we didn't have before we went in. And the point wasn't to develop them and make songs of them. It was to have the ideas in the first place and to do something, but spend 15 minutes of them there, give them their moment in the sun. Do you feel like there's other creative moments that you've had like that? I mean, you've mentioned a few already. Ones we didn't get to earlier were creative tools in the studio. So I know there was something on your Instagram I looked at earlier where you used like a wine box to record with. So is there any thing that springs to mind for you, like kind of out there creative ideas?
Out there creative ideas, mostly have come from kind of, it's very rare that I have a moment where I think I don't know how to create that sound in the studio, because as I mentioned, I've kind of built it to know everything inside out, but sometimes you feel like you kind of exhausted all of the equipment available to you. And the most ridiculous one was probably the electric kazoo that I had someone singing to, which was then running through a 5150 guitar amp.
What did that sound like?
Fantastic.
What was the intention in the mix? Like, how did that fit into the mix? What was its service?
It was like a little really subtle vocal. It was a double on the main vocal through the bridge, and it just needed a little lift to give it a bit of character. The song felt like it was dragging on a little bit at that point, and this just gave you something a little bit interesting to latch onto. But these things just come along. Like, the guitarist had brought this electric kazoo in with him because he thought it was funny. And then we thought, we could plug that into an amp and see what it sounds like. And it sounded ridiculous, so I got the singer to sing into the bottom of the kazoo. I love that. And it made the final mix. Yeah, sometimes, again, you can be surprised by your own creative output. I've also recorded, there's a river that runs behind the studio. I've killed a few mics by recording that river. But it sounds fantastic. That's cool. I mean, you see a lot in studios where people use things like cloths to hang over drums, or
stuffing. I mean, the classic is using duvets and things like that to pad out drum kits and whatnot. And that I've seen people use wallets taped down to snare drums to dampen them. You know, there's some of the classics there. But again, maybe we're just returning this somehow to creativity. I guess the only thing I would like to ask is, you know, it's a podcast loosely about not just the creative process, but kind of creativity in itself. So I wonder what your thoughts were on ideas themselves. Like, where do you feel like good ideas are coming from for you?
Good ideas in terms of in a musical context or just in general? In
any context, I suppose. It's up to you. Take that wherever you like.
I think that the best ideas come from, again, a problem. I think it's rare that you are completely within your comfort zone and everything's going smoothly and you come up with a brilliant idea.
Mm.
I think my best ideas have come from kind of where you don't really know where it's going, or you try something that you didn't think could possibly work.
Yeah. And then it does.
Yeah. And I think creativity as a whole is, it has bizarre connotations, I think. When I was reading through the brief you sent me, I thought I'd talk about my brother a little bit.
Sure.
Who he is a scientist, and he's living in California at the moment, doing all this DNA testing for the COVID tests and developing all the vaccines and all this stuff. And people commonly, when we were growing up, would say how different we were in terms of, like, I was the creative one doing music and all these things, and he was book smart. But I think that he's equally as creative because it's not music that he's creating. I mean, the amount of creativity you have to invent a genetic test for something, you know, it's equally stuff that nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, I think that's where people treat creativity as a synonym for artistry.
Yeah.
Where they're different things. I think having an imagination and the space for it and being willing to pull ideas forth and make them concrete, I think that's all creativity really is to me. It's certainly easier to get at it by talking to somebody who works in the arts, or something that's quite obviously what most people would agree is creative. But I still think there's room to discuss it with people like that. I find it quite odd when people claim they are not creative, because it implies to me that you would be almost catatonic if you weren't creative. I don't see how you could function to do anything. And I think it's by committing that same logical error and saying and assuming that creativity is the same thing as artwork. Do you think is the problem that I'm saying there, does it exist? Is it real? Are we speaking about creativity sensibly, or could we be doing better?
Yeah, I think that it's too strong of a link between media and creativity and not problem solving.
Mm.
And I went out to visit my brother last year, and it was very clear. He's only 25 and he's running this enormous multi-million-dollar business. The people who work for him are obviously very clever, but don't have the same creativity and problem-solving skills.
Yeah.
I think it's often overlooked that someone in that field could be equally as creative as a musician.
What do you think those skills are then that they might be overlooking or not quite having?
I'm not sure. No, it's problem solving is the root of it, isn't it?
I think so.
And the willingness to tackle a seemingly unsolvable problem.
Yeah, that certainly gets in the way. I think that kind of brings it back to how we began when we were speaking about you starting the studio and sourcing all of the equipment, is that people sometimes see a problem and see it as insurmountable and simply give up. Whereas you maybe haven't done that, and you've just said, this is a problem that is solved not by going forwards, but by climbing sideways or even climbing down in some point before you can go back upwards. I really do like the analogy of bouldering. So the more that I speak with you, the happier I am that we began with that specifically. Let's wrap this up then, because we've been going at it for about an hour at this point. Before we do, is there anything that we didn't mention about creativity or the process that you do as a producer or a musician that we should have mentioned?
I can't think of anything now. Great.
Compliment to me, that. In which case, where can people find you?
Instagram's probably the best place, Gafro Studios. And my website is jafrostudios.co.uk.
And that's Jafro with a G.
Jafro with a G. Ginger Afro.
Yeah, people who are listening to this as a podcast will not be able to appreciate the glory of your hair, unfortunately. It's magnificent.
Thank you.
Anyway, thanks for this. It was absolutely great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.